Hello and welcome back to Jimbo's PC Builds. Today is going to be the second part of my vlog covering upgrading my build up to my first ever liquid cooled, well, custom loop liquid cooled build. So without further ado, let's get to it. So in today's vlog I'm going to cover installing the CPU block and also putting the GPU block on. The second part is obviously a lot more intensive because installing the CPU block's like installing, say, a cooler or whatever, but with installing a GPU block you've got to take the original cooler off and then you've got to put the new water block on. So it's a lot more of an intensive exercise, and as part of that as well you've got to also put your thermal pads on, that kind of good stuff. So I'm going to break this up into two parts. The first short part is going to be putting the CPU block on. Now I'm not going to cover like installing the CPU, doing the RAM. I've done that in other builds before. I'm literally just going to cover installing the CPU block. So let's have a look at which CPU block I'm going to install. So as I mentioned in my first part of my vlog, I'm going to be using this, which is the Jayz2Cents block, which is the XC8 RGB Pro Hydro series from Corsair. I was lucky I bought this in the first run of the block, so I happened to be watching the episode when it went live and I was able to get in and get it straight away. So this is one of the originals, which was very lucky. They're now pretty available because they've done several runs since, but you know, this is the first run. It looks a pretty decent block. I can't wait to get it in. So yeah, without further ado, let's get on with putting the CPU block in. Now, disclaimer at this point, I recorded the audio as I was actually installing the CPU block, so yeah, it's not the best, but it's pretty good. So I'd like it doing it that way because it's like an ongoing commentary while I've done it. Once I finish that, I'll give you my thoughts on the CPU block install, any problems I hit, that kind of good stuff. Alright, on to the install. So I'm going to be doing the install of the cooler block now. It's quite cool, as you can see. There was Jay covered in his video. It's actually got his logo in the pre-applied thermal paste, which is what I'm going to use. There's no point in getting rid of it. It's supposed to be pretty good anyway. And there's a back bracket which has actually got adhesive bits on it, so it goes through the holes and then actually sticks, which is going to make it easier to install because then you've got to line up the screws with what pokes through and then screw it down. So what I'm going to try, I'm going to attach this first, and then I'm going to leave this cover on and make sure about lining the screws up, and then once I've got them lined up I'll take the cover off, apply it to the CPU, bingo bango, we've got the CPU block installed. So the first thing I've got to do is remove the covers from the adhesive parts on the back. Then I'm going to lift up the motherboard and then try and line them up. I can see now why they put stickers on them, because of the back plate at the back. They don't stay in place. So I've got them in, and I'm now going to use the weight of the motherboard to make sure they stay there. There we go. So now I'm going to line these up. That one's lined up there. That one's lined up there. Can't really see that one. No, that's not lined up. Might have to change the orientation of the bracket, I guess. See if it's that way. Those two are perfect. Okay. Now I don't want the Jayz2Cents logo orientated, so it's that way. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to change the orientation on it. Well, doing this orientation, I could lump it now. That screw attached. That's not going to work. Check it's through the back, there's nothing coming off. Yep. So that now means that the block is now in place. So a couple of things stuck out for me about installing the CPU block. The first one is, as I mentioned in the sort of install, there was a backplate that stuck on using pads. Now on the motherboard I was using, which is the Gigabyte Z690 Aero G DDR4, there's an audio plate on the back, which I think is pretty standard for Intel Series 12 boards. But when I tried to stick it on, it would just ping off all the time. So I had to use the weight of the motherboard and put it on the box to get it to protrude through to the point where I could get the actual screws through and hit the actual holes that it needs to go into. That was a little bit of a challenge because I had to lean on the block quite a bit, probably more than I should have done, but it's what I had to do. Okay, that was the first part. The second part was I had to change the orientation of the block, so the Jayz2Cents logo was facing the right way. The problem I had with that is I could take the mechanism off, but I had real trouble for some reason in getting it back on. I don't know if that was just me, which there's every chance it was, or there was an actual issue with trying to get it back on. But either way, I had a little bit of difficulty with that. I was at it for a while. I cut that out of the edited video that you've just seen, purely because you don't want to see a video of me sitting there going like this for about 10 minutes, which is pretty much how long it would take. But once I got it sorted, it went on, the logo looks good, it's orientated the right way, and the holes for the tubes are perfectly orientated, and it's going to be good. Alright, so now we've done the CPU block, now let's get on to the GPU block. This is going to be a much longer process. I didn't record audio for this, so I'm going to be dubbing audio on afterwards, so hopefully the audio will be a bit clearer. But if I'm catching up a little bit with the audio, then you know why, because I'm having to record it on afterwards. But yeah, let's get on with the GPU block install. Oh, hang on. This is the GPU block I'm installing. It's a Bitspower block specifically made for my EVGA 3080 for the Win 3. So, oh, it's the Ultra, yes. So this is the block. I think it also covers the 3090 as well. I think it's the same block. But yeah, this is the one I bought for it. So, right, now let's get to the install. So the first thing you've got to do is take all the screws out. It's a pretty lengthy process. You've got to take each screw individually. I think there's about 12, 13 screws maybe, but it does take a while. One thing you've got to be aware of is towards the front of the GPU, and you can see them towards the bottom left hand corner, sort of close to where my watch is now. There's it's not just a screw, there's like a little nut underneath. So when you're taking that one off, you have to sort of like put your finger below, grab the little nut and then unscrew it. Because if you just try and unscrew it normally, it won't come away. So I'd actually loosened it and I didn't suss that originally. So as you can see here, I'm struggling a little bit, and then what I'm doing is realising I put my fingers underneath to hold the nut, and I'm able to actually pull it out. So it works. It's a bit of a pain, but once you've done it, it's okay. But some of the screws don't come away that easily. You probably noticed towards the top there is actually a warranty sticker on the back of the GPU, so you know you've got to worry about that one. You've actually got to break through the warranty seal to actually unscrew it. But each of the screws comes away pretty easily, I would say. So here I am finally taking these. There you go. You see I picked the nut underneath. I think there was 2 of them, but now you see I've got them all, and there we go. I've sussed I've got to do the warranty one. So I've checked, and there you've got to break the seal, and then you've got to undo the screw like so, and eventually it comes away. And then once you've done that, then I was able to get the back plate off pretty easily. Oh, still haven't done 1 screw left. There you go. Screw done, back plate off. There you go. So once I got the back plate done, I kept all the screws to the side. I had to come on to taking off the bracket which the cooler is attached to, which keeps the tension on the actual GPU processing unit. Now, I did the old method of doing each corner by 1, so I wasn't trying to do pressure in too many places. I was leaving them pressure slowly, evenly. As you can see, they start to come away, and once they've come away evenly, then it comes off pretty easily. So once you've taken that off, you've got to try and start prying the actual GPU board itself away from the cooler, because with the thermal pads that's in there, they're making the board stick, because over time with heat generated as you've used the GPU, as in my case I use it for quite a while, it makes it stick. So you've got to, I think it was the iFixit to pull it off. Then once you've got it pried off, then you've got the first one I did was the fan header, and then there's I think it's 3 other headers on the bottom of the cooler. I found them a little bit fiddly, and I had trouble getting my fingers in there. I've got fat fingers and I've not got great nails on them, so I actually had to sort of try and get the tweezers in there like that and try and get them out. I think I was being a little bit I wasn't pulling the card way enough. There you go. I realised I could get the card further away and make it easy for me to get my fingers in. So that's a mistake that's easily made. So once I was able to do that, I was able to get them a lot easier, and I was able to pry each one individually away. Still not the easiest thing to do, but I eventually got the hang of it and I managed to get them out. And there we go. That is now the cooler separated from the GPU, and you can see some of the pads stuck to the actual cooler itself. The next part of the process is to actually remove what's left of the thermal pads that's stuck on to like the memory units, the chokes, that kind of good stuff. So I was trying to do it with tweezers, and I found because that the pads have been softened up over time, I wasn't just be able to pick them and pull them off. So I had to get the old scraper out, and I actually literally had to bit by bit scrape them away. It's a bit of a painful process, but it's worth it. You know, it is what it is. I got most of it off with the old scraper. I managed to get I had some bits that got stuck in between, and I don't think I've got any of it shown in this video. But what I had to do, and I'm doing a little bit of the scraper, but what I had to do was get the tweezers out and pick any little bits that were left in between the chokes or in between the memory chips or whatever. So yeah, once that's done, then you can go out. I was actually onto the memory chips, and because the pads on those are quite bigger, I tended to get more of it away, so it was a lot easier. But they still broke up because they were very, very soft. So obviously over time they soaked up a lot of heat and got pretty soft. But I managed to get them away. So that's now all the chokes done. Now I'm just doing the memory modules. Or should I say the chokes on one side of the GPU done, now I'm doing the memory modules. And on some of these I was actually able to get the tweezers in and get some of it away. But again, when I tried doing it, it was like, it's just it's soft and it's flaking away. So get the scraper out again and get most of it off. And you can see clearly in the video that there's some left. I tried to scrape most of it away, but there was still a little bit of residue again, which I'll have to get with tweezers at a later point. As I was going, I was spotting little bits I'd missed, and I'd go back. But now I'm back onto the memory module on the other side. Now you'll see I'm not holding the board that much. The reason I was doing that is to try and avoid, and I know you can see I've got my anti-static bond to try and make sure I'm earthed, but I was, with being my first attempt at doing this, I was very worried about shorting the graphics card, because now with its cooler off, obviously there's no backplate in between, so it's very vulnerable. Some of the ones like that one I got really lucky because that came away. Once I actually got all of the pads away, I then wanted to clean up the actual GPU processing unit. Now I wanted to make sure I didn't get a lot of contact involved, so I got some Q-tips and I got the old rubbing alcohol out, and I used that method. And what I did is I started from the middle, I'd use several Q-tips to avoid just smearing the thermal compound around. So I'd use several, and you can see this is on my second Q-tip, and I'm trying to get it off. I'm trying to do it bit by bit, trying to make sure it's completely clean. Again, try not to smear, so rotating the Q-tip as well to make sure I'm not getting it all in one place. And there we go, you can see it's coming up pretty nice now. You can really see the actual processing unit there. It's coming up nice and clear. So there you go, that was that cleaned out. Next, I then went on to using it on some of the chokes, etc., to make sure there was no thermal pads residue left on them, to clean them up nice. At some points I would use this and I would push, and there were little bits that would bring up, so I'd have to either flick them off the Q-tip, or I'd have to get tweezers in to pull them out. A bit of a process, and there you go, shaking it off as well to try and get rid of any bits that fell away. So again, repeating that process for all of the little chokes and chips or whatever, where you've got some bits left. It's a long process, and I would say that I had to take my time with this. I've sped up the footage to try and mean that the video doesn't go on too long. But this was a long, laborious process, but you've got to keep patient with it. Because if you don't, then you could make a mistake, you could leave some thermal compound in the wrong place, you could create a short, whatever. So I'm trying to be as careful as I possibly can, and when you are handling a bare board like this, where there's literally no protection from anything else, you've just got to be that little bit more careful. So as you can see now, I'm onto the last set of chokes on the far side, and what you can see there is actually, when I was actually doing it, some actual chunks of thermal pad were coming away. So I was having to shake them off the Q-tip because obviously they were too big. But yeah, there you go, that's everything done now pretty much, and that's one board clear. Now it's on to putting actual new thermal pads on. Now the method I used for this is, I'd watched in another video on YouTube, was I would put them on, and then I'd use my Stanley knife to literally just put a little indentation on the length that I needed. Then I'd take it off, I'd pull the sticky off both sides, and then I'd pull it on. This obviously is fine for this, because in this particular case, for these memory chips, the width of the pad is about the same as the memory chips themselves, so all I had to do was cut for length. So it was a lot easier. Again, we got lucky with that one, because what was left pretty much matched exactly what needed to go on the memory chips. Okay, for some of the chokes to the side, I had to do length, but I also had to do width as well. So what I did is I did two marks like that. So I had a mark for length, which I then cut, and then I did one for length as well, to width as well, to end up with all I needed to be able to stick on. And again, once I removed the peeling from both sides, I was able to take the length that I needed, and then apply it to the chokes. And in this case, I was managed to get lucky, because what was left was pretty much exactly what I needed to go down the far side. Cut off a little bit, but there you go. And you've got to be careful when obviously measuring them as well. You don't want to get them too thin, because they won't go full coverage, but you also don't want to go too wide, so you get overhang. There's another memory chip done, and I've got two left at the bottom. Now, I actually started to run out of the thermal pads in this case, so I actually bought some more from Thermal Grizzly, as you can see. Now what I was using was 1mm and 2mm pads. Again, as I stated earlier in the video, I was actually following the widths from the original cooler rather than actually following the nips needed for the block, which was a mistake on my part, but at this point in time I wasn't to realise that. So I was happily beavering away, cutting the widths that I needed, and then sticking them on. So I have to say the pads that came with the cooler were pretty good, but I'd also have to say that the Thermal Grizzly ones were pretty good. I think they were a bit better, but I didn't have all. Now for the last two memory chips, I was trying to put 2mm on, so I cheated a little bit because I'd run out of 2mm. I actually ended up trying to double up at 1mm. So you can see I've got one length and I'm cutting another, so I ended up sticking two on. Not sure if that's too much of a good idea, but it seemed to work, so I went with it and everything was good. And in this case I had trouble getting some of the backing off. To be perfectly honest, I don't know why I didn't have more of that trouble, because I've got no nails whatsoever. But just a warning, you might want nails to do that, but eventually I was able to pull the peeling off. I found some of the backing was thicker than others, and I was having trouble cutting it, but eventually I got there, so I stuck on one pad, and then I've got the next pad and I stuck it on top like so. There we go, that's all the pads on. So next I got on to putting the thermal compound on. Now I've watched several videos on this and I decided to adopt the cross method, and then I used a thermal scraper to evenly put that thermal compound across the whole of the GPU unit. One of the problems I had was trying to make sure that I was actually leaving most of it on the GPU and not actually scraping it off into the scraper. So what I was trying to do was change the angle, trying to make sure I wasn't, you know, storing any and trying to apply it all over. It was a bit of a laborious process, as a lot of this is, but I managed to get a really good even finish and get a really good coverage of the whole GPU unit, and I was very pleased with that, and it went very, very well. There we go. Okay, so now it's time to get the actual block on. So I lined it up and made sure that the actual block itself went on, and I didn't want to obviously move that lens because once it's on once, moving it around would smear any of the thermal compound or whatever. So I got that in place. Then I wanted to put the back plate on. Now the back plate itself, I tried to put on just like so, but because of the rubber pad, I had to lift it up and turn it. And then all I had to do then was make sure that all the holes lined up between the back plate and the actual front block. So then what I did is I decided to put one screw one side and one screw on the other side to stop the block and the back plate from moving, so it gave it a nice firm hold. And then from there I just went through and I put all the remaining screws in. Again, a bit of a laborious process because there's lots of them, but you've got to make sure you put them in nice and tight, but do not over tighten, because what you don't want to do is don't want to crack the block in any way by tightening in too far. So as soon as I felt like I got a good purchase and it felt nice and tight, that's where I gave up at that point. So I'm going to go through and put every screw in place like so. So it's, again, laborious process, screw after screw after screw after screw. Alright, so that's the screw. Once all the screws are in, that'll be it done. So I'll leave you to the nice little bit of music so you can watch me put the rest of the screws in. Alright. So from that recording, it looked like the install went swingingly. There was no instructions in the box on how to install the thermal pads, what thermal pads to install. It was just, there they are, there's thermal pads. So what I did is I basically looked at the thermal pads that were on with the original cooler, which is this one. So as you can see, this is a chunger of a cooler. It's very, very large. And it's obviously a little bit different than the original, the new GPU block. You can see it's got a nice copper plate in there, the black plate's nice, etc, etc, but the depth of the back plate's different, and also the features on the actual cooler are different than the GPU block. I did not know that when I originally did the install. I found out later, and I'll cover that in more detail when I go through the actual final build and you'll see it. But basically what I did is I used the same thermal pads that were with that, so I used the same width, etc, etc. When I finished that off, everything, the GPU block went on back fine. I was actually pretty happy with how it turned out. It looked really good, seemed really stable, everything was great. I did a test run on a test bed, and literally getting to the point where it hit Windows, the signal would just cut out every time. So I was worried that there was a problem with the graphics card. I tested the Intel built-in graphics and it came up fine, so there was nothing wrong with anything else. So what I did is I took everything off, took the GPU block, everything else, and I redid the thermal pads. But this time I went to the Bitspower website just in case there was instructions, and there were. And what happened was I put thermal pads on that were too thick. So then there wasn't sufficient contact between the actual cooler and the GPU main unit, so therefore it was basically shutting down because it was getting too hot. Okay, so that was lesson learned. So I think this is my first ever time I've done it, so if you were to learn anything from this, then I would say always try and find instructions for putting the GPU block on to make sure you get the correct thickness of your thermal pads every time. Originally I thought it was because I hadn't cut and put in the thermal pads okay, but they were fine. It was just the thickness in certain areas meant that there wasn't sufficient contact with the main graphics processing unit. Alright, I hope that information is useful, and I hope the basically following how to do a GPU block install was helpful as well as the CPU. The CPU block's relatively simple, but the GPU is a process. So, you know, I would say that, you know, that one is the better one to follow. Apart from the little mistake I made with the thermal pads, everything else I did is the way that you should do it and the way it should be done. So again, I hope that was useful. If you did like this video, please toss a like on it. If you didn't like the video, please leave a reason why so we can try and improve the channel. If you fancy subscribing, that would really be helpful. I'm getting very close to the 1,000 subscribers now, so that would be great. If you do subscribe, don't forget to smash that bell icon so you can be notified of future content. I try and get a video out every month. I don't manage to be able to create content as much as others, unfortunately, because of work commitments, etc, etc. So hitting the bell icon will be pretty cool, because then you'll get notified when I've got a video out. Alright, that's all of the usual spiel for YouTube. Nothing left to say other than take care.